Hi, my name is Maaret, and I'm a tester. I identify as a specific type of a tester. I'm an exploratory tester, and this talk is really about what that means, and in particular, what that means in relation to automation. The things that I do is that I find myself spending time, thank you. Yeah, I got my thing back. So I find myself spending time with applications, finding problems. And a lot of times when I find problems, my colleagues, my developer colleagues in particular, they like to tell me that I broke it. But actually it always was broken when I came in. I just somehow managed to find these different kinds of paths into the application that reveal that whatever we thought was working actually wasn't working, and the only thing I ever break is people's illusions. And I kind of specialize in this. I specialize in this in the way that when I'm exploring, the most important thing for me is that I have an application, something that I use, something that I have my hands on, something that piques my interest, something that makes me actively think, something that is kind of like my external imagination. So sometimes people think I might be somehow a little bit weird in the sense of I use an application, whatever application it is, and it's almost as if it was talking to me. I'm pretty sure there's some people in the room who recognize this kind of a feeling. There's an application, when you use it, it kind of tells you, oh, you'd want to click this button. Or you see that, oh, there's this field, you'd want to put here some kind of information. And you have all these different ideas of what you could do, what people generally would want to do, what is right, what kind of things are wrong, and just, actively going through all those different paths of thinking through what kind of things we might use on the application. But, since explaining exploratory testing is always hard, what I like to do is I like to do a demo of what does it look like. Because again, a lot of times this idea of you look at an application and somehow it acts as your external imagination, it's a little bit difficult. And it's also this idea of learning in layers, and often it's best if I just try showing it to you. So I have here an application that has a specification. This is a little exercise application called Gilded Rose. It was created by Emily Page, a programmer lady from Sweden. And basically the specification very simply just says that, there's all these kinds of values. There's a value called selling and a quality in some kind of a store. And then there's all these different kind of requirements. You don't really need to remember this. You don't need to even know it. I've been trying to go through the specification and remember some of that. So that's the specification. But the specification isn't the only thing that I would need when I'm testing. I would also need the application. And the application is here. So Emily has been kind enough to implement a very, very beautiful piece of code that I'm supposed to be testing. And as you can see, even though it's kind of short, it's just like 60-something lines, it's not one of the easiest reads. So every developer's dream, and this is in production, legacy code. It serves its purpose. Users are happy with it, but we need to start changing it. Absolutely no tests exist. That's kind of the starting point of this application. And to kind of get started, I also have a sample test, and just to see that, this thing seems to be working, I can just run my test here and see that, okay, green seems that if I put into this check item thing, here's my user interface. If I put in different values, I put in items, I put in how many days I'm selling this item, and what's the quality in the beginning, and I'm running through this thing here, I can check then what happens in the next day. So if in goes something 0 and 0, seems like, well, the quality is a 0 after that. So if I wanted to explore this, what I could of course start doing is just creating new cases. And some of the things that usually interest exploratory testers first is to understand how the application could even work. That sample that I have been given isn't the best one to understand how the application even works. I don't really pay attention so much to naming right now. I could just call it foo. When I know what I want to name it, I can always go back and name it better. But right now, I'm just trying to learn what the application is doing. So if I have a thing called something, when it's already old, it sounds like a kind of like an eccentric case. I would rather see how things behave in a normal case. So let's say it's going to be sold for 10 days, and it needs to have a quality that is positive so that it can change either up or down. Based on the specification, I would expect it's going down, but I don't want to use 10, because 10, if it's symmetric, if these are somehow intertwined anywhere, it would not make it easy for me to notice that things are broken. So I would want to use something else. I also don't want to use 9, it's kind of too close to that. So today I feel like a 4. So, it's a number just somehow coming out of what I feel right now. And every single time, usually it's something a little bit different. But the basic rules still apply. So I can run this. I don't need to care right now if it fails or not. I'm kind of expecting that it would fail. But what I want to see is, what does it give me? Okay, so I know that it gives me a 3. So I need to stop for a moment just to think, is 3 something that I'm happy with? So it was 4 in as an input. It goes down by 1. Yeah, it seems to be kind of in accordance to the specification. So that's something that I do. And running it again, the code is legacy. It's running in production. I could also say that whatever tests I create are just, okay and good, in the sense of nobody's complaining about the old version. If we're changing this, all the old bugs are fine. But if anything new is going to be found, that's what we would be interested in. I could also be doing things like running this under coverage. Sorry. Running this under coverage, just to see that the code seems to be not particularly well covered with my 2 little tests. But at this point, I'm going to get very, very bored with having to copy-paste so much. So a lot of times when I'm exploring, I'm right now, right away, jumping into tools that enable that kind of work a lot easier. So the thing that I have here is called approval tests. And basically what I can just do, this is a combinations approval test. I can just give different values as lists. So I had a value 4, or value 10 for the sell-ins. And I had a value 4 for the qualities, in addition to the original 0. And when I run this, I expect it to fail and ask me to approve whatever I have right now. So it seems like if something goes in with the value 10 and 4, I'm getting 9 days back and a 3, which was something that we already kind of established, that was okay. And similarly, 0, 0, okay, fine, it goes to -1. Seems like it's always going down by 1. Like my brain is kind of making these connections to the specification, whatever there was. So since I'm happy with this, what I've seen so far, I'm just going to run it again. And now I have those tests. So now I'm really, really ready to explore. So I had all these interesting things here. In the specification, I have something called aged brie. If I copy-paste that into my list of things, I know that from the specification, I'm supposed to have values now going up. So again, I could generate new number values as well, but right now I just want to see if aged brie is behaving differently, kind of like I expect it to. And again, I expect my test to fail, because what I'm really doing is I'm exploring. I'm trying to figure out if this matches my expectation against the specification, if it matches my goal of covering the specification and my goal of covering the code. So for aged brie, it seems like that days go down by 1 as well, and the value goes up by 1. So it seems to be kind of matching the specification in the same way as before. So again, I can approve my tests, run them again, and notice that, well, I have a few more things there right now. Then again, from the specification, I feel like, taking the sulfurous would be a nice thing, but as I take it from here, and I go back to my specification on my test, and I end up running it, I'm noticing that sulfurous actually isn't behaving as the specification says. Specification says that it's a legendary item. It never is supposed to go old, and it never changes in quality. And this seems to be going down just as something, the thing named something is. So I could say there's a bug in the code, or I could be a better tester and say, there's still the code, maybe I should check that. Oh, sulfurous is not written quite as in specification, but it actually needs to have these extra bits and pieces around it so that it could ever work. So I might log a bug against the specification, I might log a bug against the code, and usually I would just have a discussion and avoid logging anything anywhere if that's possible, and just grow the understanding. And now when I run it, previously I didn't approve because I didn't like what it was. So I'm seeing that 10 days never goes down, value 4 never goes down. This seems to be what I actually expected. And I can continue this. I can continue this based on my coverage code. I can take more things from here, whatever I have, add it to the list. I can see what else I would need to do. Seems like numbers 11, 50, and 6 are somehow magical. So since I feel like not thinking too much right now, I could say 11, 50, and 6 were somehow magical. I don't actually know which list needs them, so I can just add them to both of my lists so that I get to some tests a little faster. But then, if I do this, I do cover things a lot more. But right now, I have a lot more to read, or my options are that I will use the oracle of, well, if it worked in production, this is what is in production, nobody complained. We're not really interested in any of the other problems. I could accept this. But then I might miss some of the problems against the specification that were always there, and then the question just is whether we care about them or not. So again, approving all of these, I have now 120 test cases, and running this under coverage seems that I still need something around 50 and something around 0 to actually have 100% coverage. So for selins, let's add a negative value, and since I have something around 50 already, let's put something over 50 and something just a little bit under 50 into the list. Again, we get some more tests. I could read them. I could choose not to read them. My choice always when I'm exploring. Just close this one. I had too many windows. No. And if I run this now against coverage, I have all of it green. I have something around 200 test cases, and my specification, I haven't actually covered necessarily all of it in detail, but there are things around the number 50, there are things around backstage passes and different kinds of dates. I just haven't paid attention to how correct the values are. So I just wanted to show you a little bit of a demo of what does exploration look like. And it looks like programming, right? It looks like what every single programmer does when they are looking at their applications and actively thinking what's right, what's wrong, asking questions. But what it also looks like is that I really pay mostly attention to coverage, and I pay mostly attention to specification correctness my expectations and things around that. So what did I actually do here? Oops, it decided to not show me the thing that I expected to do. Let's see. Doesn't like it anymore. Let's fix it from here. So what did I just demo? I hope I demoed exploratory testing, but I also, in some ways, I demoed test automation. So now I have automated unit tests available. I showed you how to do exploratory unit testing on legacy code. That's just one kind of exploratory testing. But I also showed you how I was combining all of the ideas that I have with about the specification, what the specification was saying, with the code coverage and the specification. There was actually a case that I was intending to show you. What if I would test with binary numbers? What do you expect to happen? It actually does work. And that's something that a typical exploratory tester might want to try and think. So my world, my experiences are just as relevant as anything that comes out of the specification. Similarly, I showed you just a few minutes of testing. It wasn't very thorough. I can't call it thorough. I can't say that even though it has a couple of hundred of test cases and 100% code coverage, that I was particularly thorough. I started taking shortcuts really, really soon. I started not looking at the values, and I started not paying attention. And I can't really pay much attention and learn in a deep and a meaningful way if I'm trying to do things fast and kind of like with a time pressure. So in projects, when I'm exploring, what I usually need is different days. Maybe I do an hour of testing today, then I need to sleep on it. I kind of like the idea of the book of how important sleep is. Sometimes that's when you process things. And then next day I'll do another hour, and as I'm learning in layers, I'm always finding these new ideas, new things, and it should never be boring. I'm not doing the same things over and over again, but I'm actively learning and paying attention to what works, what doesn't. Am I still learning? If I'm not learning and not finding any relevant information, either I need to change strategies or I need to move on to something else. But learning and paying attention to learning is really the key here. Also, what that little demonstration was trying to cover for you is that test automation, in my mind, when I'm exploring, is something that is documentation. So it helps me leave notes for future, that I use tools where it's almost like automatic that I can do that again in a later stage. Sometimes I need to pay more attention to creating that documentation, just like writing the traditional test cases. I haven't done that for quite many years, but I still remember back in many years ago when I was writing things like that it took me relevant effort to write something that is useful for the posterity. And similarly, I can nowadays use that time in writing automation that is useful for the posterity. But also, when I write automation for exploratory purposes, I don't actually have to keep all of that. I can just throw it away. So some of it might be throwaway code. It might be that I'm just playing, I'm just trying things out, and I don't need to keep all of that. So again, choosing the right ones, right pieces of that documentation for the future is part of exploratory testing. A lot of times, people draw exploratory testing kind of on the top of this test automation pyramid, that this is what we need in modern projects. But also what I was kind of trying to show with my little demo is that exploratory testing is actually in every single layer of automation and not the icing on that cake or pyramid there. So this is really not the way of how things go. This is more like when you don't know why you would be exploring and how you can combine things, this maybe then comes as a way of trying to paraphrase it. So all of this kind of comes from the experience that I have had. I've been a tester for 25 years. 25 years, it's halfway maybe to my career. I'm sort of enjoying the idea of being a tester for next 25 years, and I'm having certain doubts about the idea that a year ago they gave me a title manager that I kind of tried to somehow hide and keep under the table. But I have a team of developers and testers. Every one of us tests, including me in that particular team. But I've been a tester, and an exploratory tester in particular, for so long time that for me, I kind of like draw this box of what testing world looks like. And the main label on that box says, exploratory testing. All the things we do for testing are exploratory. And within that box, especially in the modern projects, I need to do some automation. Automation is documentation. It's something for the posterity. But also I have colleagues who have just as many years as I do in the industry. They've started out looking at things from a developer's perspective. They've been developing automation systems for exactly as long as I have been a tester. They also sort of identify as testers, but they identify as automation testers. And when we compare notes of how we look at the world, we realize that they have this big box, it's called test automation, and inside that, in order to be creating any automation that is useful for posterity, they need to be exploring so that they can find the things that they should be testing. Does it make sense? Okay. So we look at things just a little bit from different angles. Exploratory testers usually start with the idea that the first thing we need to know is to figure out how much is there to know. And the test automation people, they start with the idea that whatever we're doing first, we're going to be doing it hundreds and hundreds of times later on as well. There's no uniqueness. There's no new information or new things that I would have to worry about right now. So approaching the same problem from two different angles actually creates a fuller picture in the teams. So that's why at least our teams have both kind of people. And usually pairing these people up is a good practice. So that kind of leads us to this idea that we're all working some number of years in this industry, and we're making choices as part of our work on what we end up doing. Part of those choices are made by our managers saying, we hire you for this work. But part of those choices are things that we as individuals decide that I'm going to be splitting my workday this way. I really like the quote this morning from the first speaker about this idea that the relevant decisions are not made in boardrooms. They're made hands on the keyboard by the people doing the work. And this stuff is not decided somewhere high up, but it's something that we are making choices on what we choose to do with our time. What enables us to do good job, testing and developing things. And for me, this kind of turned into even a more personal reflection. I was asking if I am valuable, how valuable as a tester I am for my organizations. And I wanted to just kind of briefly show you what I concluded with this. So I have two stories, because basically my 25-year career looks like a series of shorter assignments. I usually have had the habit of changing jobs every 2-3 years. And my employers know that that's something that I have been aspiring to do on my career, experience different kind of companies, learn what testing looks like in different kind of companies. So I promised to go to this company for 2 years, but I ended up staying there for 4 years. This is one before my current job. And while I was there, it was kind of funny sometimes to try showing with numbers on what kind of things I was doing. They hired me because they knew that there was about 18% of errors compared to logins in their production. And everyone was basically saying, we don't know what's wrong. We don't know how the users end up here. Someone needs to tell what do you need to do? How do you reproduce these things so that they could fix them? And that's how they hired, after some 20 years of development without any testers, their first tester. For the first 2.5 years, I dug out a lot of those errors, and I dug out quite many errors that they didn't yet know or had not even created by the time I was joining. And I looked at some JIRA numbers from 2.5 years, and I realized that I had found 2,261 issues over that time, and that's, I remember calculating, it's about 8 issues per day, even on the days when I'm not at the office. So that was kind of a heavy number of bug reports that needed to be found, and I only calculated the ones that got fixed based on finding them, so not the false alarms if those should be there. And I also taught some other people to do this stuff. But the 2.5 years is the time frame when I could collect those numbers, because after that I realized that I was doing a bigger service to my company if I wouldn't log those bugs. If I would go and sit next to a developer and make sure that they know how to find those bugs, and that we would fix them before I left if I knew that there was a problem. So that was a really transformative practice. We did there also this kind of thing called mob programming. The idea was that every 2 weeks we would get together in one room and we would test or program together on one computer, whole team, using just one computer. And the rule was that whoever was on the keyboard wasn't allowed to think, and whoever was not on the keyboard, the so-called mob or the navigators, there was always one person who was channeling the rest of the group, saying what needed to happen on that keyboard. We got some Selenium tests implemented, we learned to do unit testing together, we learned to refactor together, we created some features that were supposed to take 6 months to develop, but they ended up being developed in 2 weeks. So it was really powerful practice for us. And this made me then start looking at things on like what kind of things in the end of the 4 years when I left did I leave for that company, having worked in these kind of versatile ways with that team. And I noticed that there were kind of 2 dimensions. The first dimension was whether the contribution that I was making was about me. Was it that I did some task that needed to be done that provided some value? Or was it that when I, for example, sat next to a developer, they would look at me and say, "You'd want me to click here." And then they would click there and they would find that problem themselves. And eventually, I was just joking that they just needed these voodoo dolls that they would look at so that they could be really good testers just without me being present. So that's the generative side of not really doing things, but making things so that other people end up doing them better. And then the other dimension is whether these results were available like right now, like short term, like right now something is different, or whether it's kind of like you see it in a year or over time that things are somehow changing. So in this job, well, I can say that I got some thousands of bugs fixed, so that was definitely a productive thing of me as a tester to do. And it wasn't just that I found them and logged them, but also we created ways of getting them fixed. On the generative side, I noticed that when I was sitting amongst the developers, they would know how to test, even though they didn't know, supposedly, that before. So the culture changed, was very visibly, we were able to see it kind of visibly. On the long-term and productive side, I discovered that I had forgotten that I've been programming in 14 languages since I was 12. So Felina's talk today about how we wrote basic code, that's pretty much how I got into programming as well. And I did study computer science, but I still didn't somehow think of that in that sense. And on the generative long-term side, I got people to a place where they started releasing every day, even when they didn't have automation. So the smaller increments really changed the way we were testing. Not just how testers were testing, but also how developers were testing. So lowering the level of risk and knowing that if this today's build fails, it's one of these three things that we have changed in the last day was a really valuable way of working. But it made me also reflect that, as I said, I make choices, you make choices as individuals. So there's a concept of opportunity cost. Whatever we choose to do means that we don't do something else. So I had chosen to teach developers testing. I had chosen to do a lot of testing myself. I absolutely loved the processes and the ways of working that we came up together. But I also felt like at the time when I left, there wasn't anyone other than the developers, the new testers, didn't really know all of the things I had learned in 4 years, and there was no automation that would document any of that for them. So with that lesson, I went into my new job, and my new job is actually a job that I have held once before. I came back to F-Secure after 10 years. I'm building very similar products that I did 10 years ago. And one of the things that I needed to really notice is that something had changed in the 10 years. When I was gone, and I wasn't telling that automation is difficult, and automation might be going wrong, and it might be taking focus away from the thinking and the manual side of the testing, someone had taken the time to use all that energy they didn't have to use. I'm going to say this a little bit jokingly, but all the energy that they didn't have to use on arguing with people like me, they used it on generating some automation. Well, it didn't work at first. They needed to learn many things, but they never gave up. So they had managed to build a kind of impressive test automation system. So I came back to a very different looking company. The automation system that they had built is founded, we're building Windows software. So it's founded on this idea that you need to be able to provision new virtual images quite kind of easily. It takes about 2 seconds from me saying, I want a new image, to press up a button, and then I can just take a connection into that new image. And it's the same kind of foundation for automation. I was looking at some numbers around that, and at some point at least, we were running 14,000 different individual Windows machines up and down every single day, just to be able to test on those. There's no way anyone could test on that level manually. And a lot of that automation is actually exploratory in nature. So looking at Windows 7, Windows 10, Windows XP, and the same kind of scenarios, you're actually exploring if things are, in some relevant way, different. But you're just extending your reach with automation. So I think some of the best things that happened was that I didn't actively try saying that it was a bad thing. And right now, I would actively suggest that no one would ever say that again. I recognize I have done that in the past, and I recognize that it's still a tone that I hear a lot amongst people specializing in testing, but we really need to be kind of pulling together in getting some good automation in place. But that automation, since it was in place, when I was then exploring, it gave me completely different things. One of the features that I needed to implement was around remotely managed firewall. So we took Windows Firewall and we just created some remote management on top of that. And creating rules remotely into the Windows Firewall was something that I needed to test. So we created a test case that basically enabled us to add a rule. Whatever values would go there. I think the first one was ping, so a particular protocol, a particular way of using or creating a particular type of a rule. But when I had the automation, I could easily start playing it. What if I had 10,000 pings as rules? What would happen? There's no way I could test that kind of things manually. So I could play and build on top of that. So I learned really quickly that all this exploration that we were doing, it was better if we didn't separate exploratory testing and automation. It was better if I could use the automation, the existing automation, for exploratory testing reach. It was also better if we could use it as documentation, as we talked about before. Also, I noticed that when I wanted to document things, and I wanted to write things down in automation, it forced me to really pay attention to details in a way where I usually didn't need to go if I was doing it more in the attended mode. So coding something, trying to make sure that we're checking the right value, it really makes you pay attention to details, almost like if you had a magnifying glass at the thing that you're looking at. When the automation failed, and it fails quite much, it's actually kind of like a ding-ding bell saying, pling, come here, you should be now exploring. It's the test failing, is the application failing, what kind of things should you be learning from here? So it was really an invitation to explore. And I started then looking at things in the same kind of structure, how things are in these two-dimensional things. So the way that I test, the way that I do things is very different in this job, even though I still hold a very similar job, and no one outside myself told me to behave in any different way. This is all something that you do your own juggling and your own assessment on. So I was still doing testing, definitely breaking some illusions and showing that things were not quite as nice as we would hope they would be. But usually 5-10 minutes later, really good developers in my team would know exactly where the problem was, and half an hour later it was already in the CI environment, and as if it was never there, when there was also test automation that would keep it out of that. So adding test automation scripts was definitely also on the productive side. But now, and then on the generative side, what I was doing on short term, or I'm still doing in short term, is that I still teach people through pairing on how to fix things and not create Jira tickets or long queues or things like that. But also, while I'm doing all kinds of other things, the tests that I have created, that I have automated, they are inviting me to go back because they're finding problems. So while I'm doing other things, I'm still doing testing, and that's on the generative side. I ended up with a project where I'm again looking at the layers of testing. How do we automate on the unit level versus other levels? So C++ and unit tests has been something that I've been really paying a lot of attention to. And kind of the test automation architecture in the sense of which layer the test is best automated in is a big part of the work that I do. But on the longer term generative stuff, what I usually now work on is shorter release cycles. With some millions of users, it's hard to do it daily, but every 2 weeks is something that we have gotten to from 6-month intervals. And I pair with people who don't want to pair by not saying that I'm pairing with them. So that's also something where the results are kind of seen in a longer term. But all of this kind of goes and sums up to this idea that we all are in different places of our career. Uncle Bob Martin, has sometimes talked about this idea that the size of the software industry doubles every 5 years. Which then basically, if that was true, it would mean that in a crowd like this, half of us would have less than 5 years of experience. So if my box of exploratory testing where automation is inside that box, took me 25 years to develop all of those skills so that I can juggle all of that work and feel kind of comfortable with it. The 5-year rule means that my colleague, who is now 17 and has spent 2 years in our project, he's probably not going to know all the things that I have learned over 25 years. And he needs to make those choices of what he's going to learn first a lot more strongly than I did in my past. So is it going to be automation? Is it going to be recognizing bugs and knowing how to explore? Or is it going to be something completely different? What should they focus on? What is the most valuable thing? So if our options are to focus on testing, or focus on programming, basically test automation, or focus on learning, it's kind of obvious that the learning is the first thing, but what are we then really learning on? So I grew so that I spent about 20 years with this a very strong exploratory identity that I used as an excuse to avoid automation that I could have been writing earlier. Automation was something that I added inside my box, kind of one layer at a time, starting to learn that through mob programming. And it definitely made me a more versatile tester, but I'm still a tester and I'm still an exploratory tester. So the thing that I was missing was just the attention so that my skills on the area of programming would grow into a level where they're more useful than they used to be. My colleagues, especially the ones starting with automation, I usually, in the beginning, was very frustrated with some of them, with the idea that they couldn't really test. They could automate things that other people told them to. Like, this needs to be tested, create this kind of a test case. But over time, when they first learned to be really comfortable creating Python scripts, then they were ready to start taking more of the, how do I really figure out what I need to test, what are the right values, how do I think around this? And they come kind of to the same place where I've ended up being, with using a few years there. But the 5-year rule means that you usually start from somewhere, and what you could start with is that some of the people in your team start with a strong tester identity. It's still a valid and a good thing to do to have these testers who might not be automating so heavily in your teams. And they're growing layer by layer into recognizing the problems that there are with the applications, but also recognizing in how they could effectively document things and use automation to grow their reach. So they're also getting to a better place. But then we also have the automation testers, people who start just with that focus first. And if we pair these two up, we get almost same kind of results as we would get from two, or waiting for the 20 years for someone to grow into their full capacity, or whatever, 10 years. It might be that it took me longer than necessary, but at least I had a lot of fun on my way here. So learning, and in particular learning to learn effectively, is something I would really like to leave you with. Collaborating, pairing, mobbing, letting people see how you do things, so that they don't have to ask you for things they didn't yet know how to do. So they notice you will do them, and they can then mimic that or ask more specific details of that. So collaboration skills is where we probably should be starting. We should also have some people really learning about how to explore, how to work with heuristics, how to look at an application, how to get it to actually speak back to you when you're looking at it, learning all the things around that. We need to have some people who are focusing, or some days when we're focusing on learning programming for testing, so it's not either or, we need all of this in our teams. And the basic idea is that the learning we do is a superpower. It's a superpower in the sense that if we're not learning and we are we're kind of as good as we are in a year, that's not really helping us take things to a better place. But if somehow we would find a way with active learning to add 1% increase to what value we are able to provide, in 1 year, if that's every single day of the year, we would already be almost 40 times better than our past selves. So I don't really generally care in testing whether you learn automation or whether you learn how to think. Probably you're going to be juggling both of those, because that's how the modern testers are, that we're juggling things. But if you are okay with whatever skills you have right now, as a developer, as a tester, as a test automation person, if you're okay with the skills you have right now, you're probably not going to be okay in a few years, because we're always going forward. So learning is really the superpower that what we have. So what the 4 different dimensions should really look like. We should be breaking illusions, still in a timely fashion. Timely, meaning that we're looking at very short feedback cycles in modern ways of doing testing. We should be capturing notes in automation. The automation will be doing some testing while we're gone, and hopefully there will be some AI-related work on this space as well, so that it will be doing work that we haven't done before, using the computer power to generate some more ideas into that. On the long-term scale of productive, all of us, hopefully, are getting a little bit better. We're paying attention to how we use the time and what the opportunity cost is. And hopefully we'd all be better at collaboration. And that all would then, on the generative side, mean that when we work really well together, it's not just about testers learning to learn or testers learning to test, but it's everyone learning to learn and everyone sharing these ideas of how do we actually build good working software and get better at that. Noah Sussman leaves us with this idea that we have at some point of testing history branded exploratory testing and automated testing as separate and mutually exclusive. What I wanted to kind of show you that they're actually not. And we shouldn't be shooting ourselves in the foot, but we rather should see ourselves to be at the intersection where we can choose that coming from two different directions, we can just have a common path forward. Thank you. We have like time for a question. One, maybe.
The question is about balance. How are you finding balance? What's your advice on finding balance in disposing tests versus keeping the tests? As we know, testing is quite expensive, and disposing seems not reasonable. But we also know that keeping bad tests is very costly.
So we've used this practice of putting them in quarantine for a while. And if we don't miss them when they've been in quarantine and we haven't been running them as regularly, then we could be disposing of them. So a lot of times, my first rule of disposing of tests is if they're failing often for reasons that are not about finding bugs, you should throw them away, because flaky tests that don't actually give you useful information are worse than not having tests at all. Not having a test doesn't mean that it wasn't working. So again, there's a relationship to that. So getting rid of the flaky tests first, and then actively paying attention to which tests you're running and how often, when are they failing, what are they testing, cleaning up, putting things in quarantine, so we are not running these for a while. Did we actually lose something? My ideas of this kind of come from this experience of, there was a project where we fixed our test by removing asserts until there were no asserts left. And it was one of the best automation experiences for that organization. They relied on the automated tests, but they never tested anything. They just never broke anything in relevant ways. So you will want to pay attention to where the usefulness is in your automated tests, and that's how you get away from them. Any other questions?
Hi. So I love the way that you're expressing the intersection between testing and development. That sort of dev test can be a single integrated activity. That's fantastic. Where is the business? Where is the product? Where are the business outcomes in your thinking? Is BDD anything that you've thought about? Maybe that third intersection, that third road coming in.
Yeah. So again, like for me, I think it's part of both paths of the automation and the exploration path. Business has always been kind of like walking hand in hand with testing, so that's why I don't draw it out separately. A lot of the things that traditional testers do is actually pay very close attention to what business wants, and then make sure that it gets enacted in what is going on in the projects. So it's really hand in hand going on both of the paths. So I wouldn't draw a third one. And on BDD, BDD is, for me, it's more like a way of documenting. It's been really good in organizations where the discussion with business is has that type of particularities that those examples are really helpful in having the discussion. The way that I work in my organization and my team is that we have no product owner, we talk directly to customers, and creating BDD style tests when there's no product owner, it's extra work that doesn't benefit us much, but if there needed to be a discussion that needed to be documented in that way, and the more code-like documentation wasn't sufficient, then I would pay more attention to that practice. Thank you. I'm happy to chat about anything related to testing, development, whatever type of things. So I'm going to be around all day here, so I hope that I get a chance to talk to some of you. Thanks.